Over the course of these investigations, I've had the opportunity to meet many scholars with varying theories and ideas about evidence for the Bible's historical account. To better understand these differing viewpoints, I've asked scholars to go into depth with their proposals. This has created the Thinking Man Films lecture series. Dr. Glenn Fritz is an environmental geographer who has studied the route of the Exodus for over 2 decades. His research resulted in the publication of the most in-depth books on the locations of the Red Sea crossing and Mount Sinai available today.
Well, Tim, we're talking about potential Exodus activity east of this Gulf of Aqaba, which we identified as the biblical Yam Suf. And this area is the northwest extreme part of Saudi Arabia.
And we were there in 2003.
We were there in 2003. This map gives an idea of what a small piece of land that northwestern part of Saudi Arabia really is compared to the geography of the states.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, the Gulf is on the far end of this outlined area.
And this here is all of Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
Okay.
The first thing that we need to do is to think about the concept of Mount Sinai being in northwest Saudi Arabia. And to study Sinai better, we need to understand the potential meanings of the word Sinai and the related word sin. Looking at the Bible, the word Sinim is used in Isaiah, meaning a people living at the extremity of the known world, or the land of Ceres or Chinese. In ancient Greek, Sinai means the farthest land in the Eastern Ocean to which the Greek mariners had penetrated. Moving forward in time, in English, Sino means Far East. Modern Hebrew, Sin means China. Sini means Chinese. In late Latin, Sine is Chinese. In modern Arabic, Sini is Chinese. And what's really interesting is the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aqaba, to some of the medieval Arab geographers, was called the China Sea. In Arabic, Al-Bahar Sini.
So that would have been those two arms, the Gulf of Suez and the Gulf of Aqaba?
No, I believe it just refers to the waters along the area of Arabia, which would be the Red Sea body and the Gulf of Aqaba. I don't believe it referred specifically at all to the Gulf of Suez. Mm-hmm. But the idea here with the word sin is of east, Chinese, far lands to the east.
And then if we look at Sin or Sinai, is part of that too, right? That's that understanding?
Exactly. And based on this basic study of the linguistics, I'm going to say that sin means simply east. In Hebrew, using the Hebrew grammar, I can derive the idea of a plural possessive, meaning easts or of easts, for the word Sinai. So this is actually like a superlative. This would mean farther east or the east of easts.
Yeah, so you have east and then you have east of east.
Exactly. And it's a very simple idea, but we're talking about an uncharted territory in which Moses had to assign some sense of direction.
And in the English language, you know, if you think about it, there's actually the term Far East.
Exactly.
So they must have been east and far east.
I think you're right.
Sin and Sinai.
And I think that would carry over to the thinking and meanings of these names.
So if I look at it here, you have the wilderness of Sin, or the wilderness of east, the wilderness of Sinai, wilderness of east, plural.
Yes, yes.
So it's getting further.
Further.
And Mount Sinai, mountain of east.
Right. And so we'll think of these terms as we talk about Mount Sinai and the geography in the sense of east and far east. Another word that's used in the Exodus is Horeb. The first thing to note is that Horeb was a region, it was not a mountain. Many times people will say Sinai and Horeb were equivalent, but they're not. Some other people will say that Sinai was one mountain and Horeb was an adjacent mountain, but that's not correct either. Horeb was a region. The grammar use with Sinai and Horeb is revealing in that it said that Moses was on Sinai and the people were in Horeb in the Hebrew grammar. So that gives us a hint of an elevation versus a region.
Yeah, for over a decade, as I've been talking to people, they were saying Mount Horeb.
Exactly.
But in other words, that's once again going back and looking at it, that they were in the area of Horeb, but the mountain was Sinai.
And we'll see that that idea comes from Exodus 3:1, where Moses went to the mountain of God, and the translation tradition has made it seem as though the name of the mountain of God was Horeb. But that's a mistaken idea. And that can be shown in the geography, because when the Hebrews entered Rephidim, which was a region, they encountered the rock in Horeb. So that tells us that the rock was in Horeb, that all or part of Rephidim was in Horeb. Furthermore, when they left Rephidim, they entered a different district called the Wilderness of Sinai, and that also was in Horeb, as was Mount Sinai. So we have these two major regions and the event of the rock in Horeb all being within the Horeb region.
I see that now, yeah. For example, Pikes Peak. It's really in the region of Colorado, right?
Yes.
And it's near Colorado Springs, but as you're honing in on it, but it's Pikes Peak is a mountain in the region of Colorado.
Right. And expanding on that idea, we could say the peak of Colorado, and people would say, well, that's Pikes Peak. I would say, no, it's a peak of Colorado, just like Sinai was a peak of the region of Horeb. And people, therefore, will apply Horeb to the peak itself. But Sinai was actually a mount within the region. It was a mount of Horeb. And you'll see that language in the Bible where it says Mount of Horeb, but it's actually talking about a peak located in the region of Horeb. And so there's a little bit of a linguistic thing there that we have to look at in terms of the idiom of the Hebrew and understanding what the geography is to understand the phrase. There's certain criteria we can set up for a Mount Sinai location. This is a map showing northwest Saudi Arabia in the area of ancient Midian. This is the head of the Red Sea. There are geological conditions that dictate where Mount Sinai might be located.
And did those come from the biblical text?
Actually, they come from a variety of sources: historical, biblical, geographical. First of all, since we've identified Yam Suf, the Sea of the Exodus, as being the Gulf of Aqaba, which is in this location here, we know that the peak must be east of Yam Suf. That puts us in this region in Arabia. Secondly, the historians Josephus and Philo said that Mount Sinai was the tallest peak in the region. So we're looking for a tall peak or the tallest peak in this region east of the sea. Then we know from historians Eusebius and Jerome, which we'll look at in a few minutes, that Midian was in the proximity of the mountain. And if we can identify where ancient Midian is, we know that we're looking for the tallest mountain, at least in the vicinity of Midian.
And that's because Moses actually lived in the land of Midian, so he would have been close by, I would think. When
Exactly.
He
exiled for 40 years in the land of Midian, and then he took Jethro's herds from Midian to the mountain of God, which is the same as Mount Sinai. And so there's a sense of proximity there. The mountain was not necessarily within Midian, but there's an idea of proximity just in that story. Then we do read in Exodus chapter 3 that the mountain was located on the backside of a wilderness relative to Midian. If we look at this map, there's a mountain range lying between the sea and the highland sandy plateau. This rough mountain range, wilderness, is very difficult to traverse. There are very few navigable routes through this rough wilderness.
And when I've been in this area, and you get an idea that there's nothing there. There's no. If you were there, you would have a difficult time surviving, because you have to get to the places where there's water.
Yes, and the coastal oases were key population areas for that reason.
And so this whole vast area up and through here is a wilderness area. It's very difficult to exist in.
Exactly. And for Moses to take the flocks to a highland pasture for seasonal feeding, he would go to the highlands, which is called the Hisma now. In antiquity, at the time of the Bible, I believe Horeb was the name for the region. And therefore, we're looking for a mountain on the backside of this wilderness, the rear of the wilderness, because Moses went to the rear of the wilderness where he encountered the mountain of God.
And what you're suggesting then is that this area through here is Midian, right?
I'm suggesting that the coastal area that was habitable due to water was Midian. The mountainous region was certainly frequented by the herders, the people for pastoral reasons, but I don't think it was really settled like the coastal area was. So I confine Midian to the coastal oases where there would have been water resources. And then to feed the herds in the warm summer months, they'd go to the highlands, which this is a 4,000-foot plateau. They have to go behind the wilderness to reach this sandstone area.
And they would do that because the higher elevation would be cooler, and they would probably still have vegetation that hadn't been burned out, right, because of the sun?
Well, evidently the spring months and the summer months did have better vegetation. Some of the historical reports indicate that, but certainly cooler temperatures as well. And so the next condition would be a highland pasture setting, which we've already been discussing, that the mountain of God would be associated with a setting suitable for pasturing, and that would have been the highlands. And so the interface of the mountain would be toward this highland pasture area. It wouldn't be toward the rocky, desolate mountain ranges that lie in this part of the wilderness. It would be on the back side of that, facing the highlands. So that's why a highland setting for the base of Mount Sinai is one of the conditions listed here.
I remember reading that it says that Moses went to the far side or the back side of the wilderness.
Exactly, that's in Exodus 3:1.
So that means that if he was living in this area here with his father-in-law, and this is the wilderness, you're suggesting that he went somehow back to this area.
Exactly. He had to get to the backside, the back edge, and this is relative to Midian. You have Midian here, you have the sea is the front side, and the backside is the wilderness. So he moved to the backside relative to where he was living, his habitation.
Is there any precedent in throughout history that people actually grazed animals?
There is. That's a Bedouin historically observed activity, and the seasonal movement of the herds was a common thing in the history that we do have.
So it's been happening. They've come from this area and they've moved back into this area.
Exactly. And I believe that the story of Moses taking the herds to the backside of the wilderness was not a one-time thing. It was an annual event to do that with the herds. Another geographical condition is passable routes of travel, not just for herdsmen, but for a multitude. This mountain had to be reached by a broad, navigable route within the wilderness in order to be justified as Mount Sinai. That means that there has to be a corridor through this wilderness that could be traversed by a large multitude with their herds. On this particular map here, I show a couple of trails that a herdsman could follow to reach the backside of the wilderness, but they wouldn't be suitable for a multitude. There is a route to the south here that we'll discuss later that is suitable and was the main route between the inland and the Red Sea coast. So we have to have traversable routes. We can't have steep slopes and narrow passes. We have to have something that is broad and wide and accessible to hundreds of thousands of people. The final point is that the terrain around the mountain needs to be large enough and of a condition that could host the multitude for 11 months. They were at the mountain for 11 months and 5 days.
And you think there's an area that has that?
Yes, and if we look at the various mountain peaks in this area, First of all, the lower peaks I rule out because of the condition that the highest peak was Mount Sinai. I rule out peaks that you can't get to, and I rule out peaks that don't have space around the base of the mountain. So based on this list here and just the physical geography of this area, you can scan through the topography and say, well, these mountains are not candidates for Mount Sinai. It very readily narrows down the search. And then we're looking for a mountain that lies on the back side of this wilderness with slopes that would face the highland pasture area. So slopes that are facing primarily to the ocean don't fit the idea of accessibility from the highland pasture area. And these are all geographical conditions. There's nothing archaeological here because you have to set up a geographical framework for the location of the mountain before any kind of archaeological supposition can work. Tim, what I'm doing here is looking for geographical conditions to locate Mount Sinai and to weed out the candidates that don't fit.
As opposed to finding something that might look like archaeology?
Exactly. The archaeological conditions that may be present in certain areas can't be applied unless you have a geographical framework that works. So we want to nail down the potential location for Mount Sinai geographically, and then if there is archaeology in that area, we have a way to start focusing in on categorizing that.
So if we look at your pattern, you're saying it has to be, number one, east of Yam Suf, which what you're saying is the Gulf of Aqaba. It's the tallest peak in the region, according to historians, Josephus and Philo. It's in a proximity of ancient Midian, and we know that northwest Saudi Arabia is where ancient Midian has been defined as being the location. And it's on the backside of the wilderness, and so you've explained that.
Relative to Midian.
Relative to Midian, yeah. And it's a high pasture setting, which is this high pasture of what you're suggesting, which is what you've seen throughout history with the tradition of Bedouins being up in this area. It has a passable travel routes for a multitude, which you're going to show me, right?
Yes, we're going to go over that.
Possibilities there. The terrain would be able to host a multitude for at least 11 months.
Correct.
All right, well, I'd like to see how this comes together.
Jebel al-Makla, which is part of the Jebel Law's range, shown here, turns out to be the likely candidate without going through all of the research and steps to arrive at that. Jebel al-Lawz does have the highest peak in the region. Jebel Makla is part of the range. It's about 4.5 miles away, but it is part of the Jebel al-Lawz range. And Jebel Makla does happen to meet all of the conditions that we just discussed. So we're going to keep this in mind as our hypothesis for the location of Mount Sinai.
Could these be considered like twin peaks as well? Almost like on the same, I mean, they're the same mountain system, right? But there's two peaks.
In a way, you could think of that, but the way the terrain lays out here when you're there personally, it's hard to detect the individual peaks. And even Jebel Makla itself has two peaks. Then you have 4.5 miles away, you have the actual Jebel al-Lawz peak. These are a series of 3 high peaks, and then there's another mountain right next to Jebel Makla which has a similar height peak similar to Jebel Makla. There's actually a series of peaks in Jebel al-Lawz range, and when you're there personally, due to the terrain, it's hard to discern the heights of the peaks and the relative positions. I want to just show a profile of the topography in that area, starting with the seacoast. Then the lowlands sloping to the sea are called Ettihama. Then we have the coastal slopes called Jabal Tahama and the Continental Divide, and these mountains in general are called the Hejaz Mountains. Jebel Shafa means the mountain of the lip, and that is named because it's the lip of the Hizma, which is the highland plateau. And it's on this lip in the Jebel Shafa range that we find the range of Jebel al-Lawz located.
So you're thinking that if Moses was down in this area and he brought his sheep up, he came maybe through a pass and he would be up in this area grazing the sheep.
Exactly. he would be at the 4,000-foot plateau, and he would be discovering the slopes of the mountain of God facing this plateau, and the entire slope that faces the Hisma is called in general Jebel Shafa, the mountain of the lip. And when you're on the Hisma plateau looking at the mountains, it does look like a lip. It looks like a lip of a coffee cup. It doesn't stick up very far above the plateau because the plateau is at such a great elevation already.
And I think there was some, historical commentaries that said it was a high mountain and then it was a low mountain. I mean, do you remember what I'm saying?
Exactly. Some of the rabbinic comments were that Mount Sinai was a low mountain. And in my study of the geography, both ideas are correct. It was a high mountain and it was a low mountain.
If you're down in the coastal area, it's a high mountain.
Exactly.
If you're up here, it doesn't look that high.
It looks low, and you've been there also. These peaks do not look that high because you're already at a very high elevation. For instance, at the foot of Jebel Makla, you're at almost 5,000 feet, and you're looking at a peak that's a little over 7,000 feet.
Yes, and I can tell you that when you're at Nuweiba, you can see the peaks in Saudi. And that's the thing that I found sort of startling. In fact, when we've seen photography from up on these peaks, you can actually see out to the Red Sea.
Yes, and from the west, you have very high mountains visibly from both sides of the Gulf looking toward them. But when you're actually on the Hisma, as the rabbinic writings indicate, it appears to be a low mountain.
And if the Israelites were in an encampment here, it wouldn't have seemed like a large mountain.
No, that's definitely the case.
So why can't you just go straight from the sea to this mountain over here? Why do you have to go all the way down through here?
That's a great question, and the problem is this ridge of mountainous terrain. It's very difficult to pass through this way unless you take either the northern pass or the southern pass. So the key reason would be terrain.
Yeah, and as we've traveled here, I mean, there's no way you're going to get through this area. I mean, there's no reason for people to try to make a road through there, first of all.
Yes.
But naturally, geographically speaking, we had to find, valleys or wadis, as they were, to go up.
That's correct. And in looking at the historical routes in this area, there are only two east-west routes from the Midian area to this highland Hisma. Only two routes. One is in the far north through the Wadi Abiyad, that means a white wadi, and the one in the south follows two wadis through a pass called the Horeda Pass. I mentioned that Moses may have taken a herder route through some of the wilderness here, but these areas are not suitable to a multitude. And the only two ways to get to this highland plateau are far north and the far south of the Midian area. You can't take a shortcut to the mountain. And this is part of the reason it took 30 days to get from the wilderness of Sin to the wilderness of Sinai. It took a month because the route was not a direct route. It was inhibited by the terrain. So that's this X means that you can't go through that way, no shortcuts.
I get it. Northern route, and I think we've taken this route, didn't we?
Yes, we took part of it through here. There's now a highway that cuts this loop off right through here. So we had left the mountain this way, and then we took the highway coming through here to Wadi Afal.